Hello, everyone. My name is Kory Yueh, and I am a Community Education Fellow with Utah Global Diplomacy. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Simon Greathead, a teaching professor of international business and global supply chain management at BYU Marriott. He brings over 15 years of global industry experience in supply chain and operations leadership, primarily in Europe, before transitioning to academia in 2008. Professor Greathead holds an MBA from Henley Business School in the UK, along with master's and bachelor's degrees from BYU, with expertise in international business culture, negotiations, and decision-making. A recognized educator, he has received multiple teaching awards and has published in respected outlets like the Harvard Business Review and Ivy. Professor Greathead, thank you for giving us your time out of your busy schedule.
Yeah, thanks for that kind introduction.
No worries. So, as we begin, would it be an understatement to say that U.S. trade policy is a very dynamic beast as we move forward? Since our initial email exchange, I know that the policies have changed drastically.
I believe so. And what I'd like to tell my students is, as we talk about policy, as we talk about trade, ultimately, all of these conversations come down to two individuals across national borders trying to meet the interests of their organization. And so, as we have this conversation, I really want us to be able to have the macro conversation, but also have this micro understanding of relationships and supply chain partners that you develop over time and trust and working together for the good of both parties. It's not always the case, right? But I think generally when we talk about macro issues, we lose sight of ultimately what international business is, which is the coming together of two individuals representing hopefully common interests.
Right. Yeah, and I suppose that's a really good starting point for us to talk about these tariffs, right? With the United States announcing new tariffs, which seems like almost every day. How does this reflect the current volatility and unpredictability of the US-EU trade relationship? And what challenges does this create for Utah businesses trying to plan around global supply chains and long-term pricing?
Yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack, right? So let's talk a little bit about the global supply chains pre-COVID and then post-COVID. Pre-COVID, supply chains very much were focused on what's called just-in-time management. This idea of only having the right product in the right place at the right time, not having more, not having less. So that was pre-COVID conditions. Post-COVID, we saw some significant changes, especially around the idea of agility and holding inventory as a buffer in order to manage these types of disruptions. And the supply chains post-COVID really characteristically were quite different than pre-COVID. And so what I'm suggesting is that post-COVID, our supply chains were more agile, more responsive, maybe did hold a little more inventory in order to mitigate some of the challenges associated with maybe future conditions, whatever they may be. So I believe global supply chains generally are in a good place to manage the tariff conversation of today, which is constantly shifting. So let's talk a little bit about Utah and about what organizations and companies can do to be mindful of these disruptions. Number one, I don't think that they are going to be long-term disruptions. I think there will be a settling point. And so, first of all, organizations shouldn't be overly reactionary, but certainly responsive. So what do I mean by that? I was with a trade panel for a discussion about a month ago. We had two Utah companies. One is a multi-billion dollar multinational. One is more of a mid-sized company, up and coming, purchase a lot out of Asia. And we had several conversations about ordering more inventory today to take advantage of lower tariff rates, right? So get product in and hold inventory. Another part of the conversation was let's take a look at our tariff codes, our HTCs, our harmonized tariff codes. Are we bringing our product into the US under the right harmonized tariff code? Or can we take advantage of a more accurate representation of our product through a lower harmonized tariff code? Something else I bring up is foreign trade zones. Is our company taking advantage of a foreign trade zone? Let's bring it into Utah. By the way, we have foreign trade zones right here in Utah. Bring the product into a foreign trade zone, hold it there, especially if you're going to ship it to another country, especially. You shouldn't be taxed on that. But take advantage of foreign trade zones, certainly take advantage of the Department of Commerce. We have two great local representatives, and they have fantastic resources. And then, of course, trade organizations, the World Trade Center Utah and the World Trade Association that I'm the current president of. We have resources in import and export that can help advise small to mid-size and large companies right here in Utah.
Mhm. So thank you for answering that question. And that actually brings up a new question. You mentioned foreign trade zones. What is a foreign trade zone, and how is that something that local businesses can have access to?
Yeah, so foreign trade zones do several things, but I think for Utah companies, generally what I see two things. Meaning, if I bring product into the US, let's say from China, I don't pay an import tariff on that product until it leaves that foreign trade zone to be sold as a finished good. For instance, if I'm bringing component parts in, I can bring those component parts into the foreign trade zone, tax free, meaning tariff free. And then I can manipulate those, meaning I could take that component part, add it to several other component parts, create the finished good that I'm then going to sell in the store. And only at that point, when it leaves to be sold in the store, is it then taxable. And what that does is it helps organizations keep liquidity, right? Keeps their cash flow stronger. It doesn't hold their cash in tax. It certainly does to some degree in inventory. But remember, this is the cost of the good, meaning the cost of the component part to produce it, not the finished good price. And yeah, there's a cost to carry inventory in a foreign trade zone, but you do mitigate the risk of import tariffs.
I
So that's the first reason. The second reason would be I bring the product into the US, but I'm actually not going to sell it in the US. It's actually going to go on to Mexico. It's going to go on to Canada. Many people don't realize if you pay an import tax on that and then you send it out to Canada and to Mexico, you're going to then pay another tax, another tariff to send it out and then for it to be received in that other country. So again, a free trade zone also helps you mitigate the risk of that tariff, meaning you will not have to pay that initial import tariff. You only then pay that tariff once it goes into Canada or into Mexico. So there are other benefits, but those are the two that I often see companies take advantage of here in Utah.
I see. And since you bring up Mexico and Canada, I know that Utah has a special relationship with the United Kingdom. It received 44% of Utah's exports in 2024. So how might the 10% tariff on British goods affect local supply chains and prices? Does the foreign trade zone affect the relationship with the United Kingdom? I know these are pretty loaded questions, but I think you would also acknowledge that the UK has a special place with the Utah economy as well.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully, most of us know. If we don't, the UK is the number one trading partner with the state of Utah. And it's interesting that primarily it's commodities, right? It's gold, it's precious metals. And what we'll find is that the UK does have this currently it's 10%. I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. There are some dispensations, different tariffs for steel and so forth. But generally speaking, I think the relationship between the UK and Utah will go on as planned. What I would say is so, first of all, commodities, metals make up the mainstay of that. A good portion is also pharmaceuticals, medical device companies, airplane parts. So let me just talk to that for a minute. Let's say the 10% tariff is 2 or 3 or 5% more than the US used to pay, right? So primarily it'll be a 10% tax on anything that's sold to Utah from a UK business. So people start arguing this position of we're all going to pay 10% more. So a couple of thoughts on that. Number one, the cost of the 10% is on what's called the cost of goods, not on the retail price. So it's not on the price at the pump. It's not on the price that you pay at the store. It's on the cost of the good to be manufactured at its direct costs at its location, which is significantly cheaper. Let's take, for instance, I have a notebook here, right? You can't see it very well because of the screen, but I have a notebook. You buy that from Amazon for, say, let's say $10 or $15. but the price to produce this is maybe a dollar or two. So that 10% tariff is only on the cost of goods, that $1 to $2. So that's number one. A lot of people need to understand that. And then number two is typically those costs aren't always borne by the consumer, by you and I. Many of those costs are burdened by suppliers upstream or by the distributor that sells the product out of the UK, or it's burdened by the company in Utah that buys the product. So these costs are often, and I understand they're often burdened by the consumer, but we also need to give some level of pat on the back, if you will, to these suppliers that will absorb some of these costs. Yeah. In summary, I don't see a major change in the relationship between Utah and the UK. I think we're going to continue to see what we're seeing. I think supply chains will work together to absorb some of these potentially higher tariffs. I actually think a 10% tariff isn't too bad. If you look at all of the tariffs that have been rolled out by the Trump administration, 10% is probably one of the lower tariffs. Yeah, I think we'll continue to see a healthy relationship between the UK and Utah as it relates to our foreign trade.
First of all, thank you for that wonderful response. It does shed a lot of insight as to what's going on with our trade relationship with the United Kingdom. But since you did mention that there seems to be some sort of advantage in maintaining these relationships, what are some of the immediate strengths of these tariff policies being put in place? But what are the consequences as well? So just to reframe the question, what do you think will be the advantages moving forward? But what are the consequences moving forward for Utah businesses with these tariff policies going in and out?
So let me start with the consequences. As I've reflected on the EU's tariff level with us, which is 15%, I can't help but think that the EU feels a little hard done by. Because I think what's happening is this correction. Because over the past, let's take cars, for instance. How many German cars do we see on American roads? We see many, right? The Audis, the Mercedes, Volkswagen, and so forth. Great vehicles. I think we want to continue to buy those vehicles. But you seldom see US cars on European roads. Now, some will argue European cars are better, but that's not always the case. I think generally speaking, Chevy, I think the Japanese car brands, I think US car brands and German car brands are quite similar more than they are different. And so I think the question is, why over the last years has it cost us 10% tariff to bring in German cars? We only charge German car manufacturers 3% to import into our country. But yet the EU charges US car manufacturers 10%. And it's been that for several years. And so there is an argument, which is by increasing the tariff rate on Europe, we're essentially redressing the balance. Now, that is an argument, but there's also a counter argument to that, which is if Europe finds that the US market becomes too expensive because of this 15%, will they look elsewhere? Will there be other partners in the world? Will there be other markets in the world that will take this excess of cars? And now all of a sudden, we in the US, we have less to choose from. So I would say that's definitely a challenge and a counter argument. And I know China has a very close eye on these tariffs and what's going on, especially between the US and the EU, which are the two largest trading partners in the world. The EU is the largest trading bloc in the world collectively. And so China's watching this very carefully. And so I do think it's a bit of a razor's edge that there are benefits to the US by increasing our tariff rates, meaning we are going to get more money if they choose to sell cars here. But we may also put off some EU partners that may go elsewhere. Now, having said that, let me tell you a little bit about how supply chains generally work. I would say if you are an Airbus and you are getting product, how we know that Airbus gets product out of Utah, that these types of products are quite unique. And so finding another supplier somewhere else in the world is not easily done. And so what I tend to find when it's non-commodity items, even some commodities, when they're more unique and technical products, it's a challenge to find a new supplier. There's a cost to finding a new supplier. There's a cost to traveling around the world and having meetings. There's a cost to setting up new contracts. There are legal costs. There are so many, often hidden costs into finding a new supplier. Hence, I think this is one of the positives, meaning I do believe that the relationships between the US and EU, Utah, and our European partners are generally robust. These are products that are quite unique and that it would take a lot. Think about it. Imagine gold, for instance, or medical devices. These products are not easy to come by, especially in the quantities that Europe's purchasing them, or the technical nature of the products, not easy to come by. Not everyone could just create a medical device company. So I think supply chains are robust. Certainly no knee-jerk reaction from me. I think supply chains can absorb a lot. I think the costs can certainly be absorbed. And I think ultimately we're going to see a status quo and a settling.
For Utah businesses, as you mentioned earlier, you recommended or at least suggested that businesses should not look at this as more so as a deterrent to business, but perhaps as a stimulus. Could you talk about that just a little bit in terms of when they look at these opportunities, or if they are opportunities in their view, how should Utah businesses treat these tariff policies? Is this an opportunity? Is this a deterrent? Should they wait? Should they stock up inventory and wait out the ride? How should Utah business holders and owners really treat these tariff policies being put in place? Obviously, is there like a sense of danger is going on? The unpredictability of what's going on is also a factor as well. What is your insight onto that?
That's a very important question. And there are lots of things that Utah businesses and US businesses actually can do to be responsive to these tariffs. I think there's a short term approach and then there's a longer term approach, right? So, for instance, COVID, how long did COVID last? 2.5 years. One could argue that in many respects, supply chains returned back to pre-COVID characteristics, right? That with certain products, we can't hold inventory because it's expensive, right? We may even want to consider reshoring some products. It may cost us a little more, but if we're out of this product, then we're in trouble, right? Let's take a company in Utah that produces canoes. What does it take to make a canoe? You've got the plastic component, and then you've got the sort of hardware, the metal components. And I know that some of the plastics are purchased here in the US. Some of the metal components are purchased outside of the US. And if I had a company like that, I may say to myself, plastic resin I get in the US, that tariffs won't impact that. If it's domestic, it may have some impact, but maybe negligible. But definitely on the component parts, right, that are bought from outside the US, is it possible to stock more of those? Is it possible to nearshore that? In other words, find a company either in the US or even Canada or Mexico that's a little closer, where we have a trade agreement. So over the short term, I would be thinking to myself, I was thinking cash flow. I would be thinking getting product in the hands of the customers, meaning I can't not have my product. That would be essential. How much inventory can I hold without burdening my company and keeping my cash flow where I need it? And so these are some questions that I would be asking myself, short-term questions, right? Especially around customer need and customer supply. Longer term, I would definitely be looking at the COGS, the cost of goods sold, and the total cost of TCO, the total cost of ownership. Most companies over the short term can fill their warehouses with product and make sure their customers are taken care of, but not over the long term. And so over the long term, you may be looking at things like moving your production to out of China and maybe into Vietnam. I know there are quite a few companies that are doing that. And then there's also the pest analysis, right, where it looks at the political and the social ramifications of certain behaviors. I know right now there are some issues between this tensions, right, politically between the US and China. And so is it risky to be in China over the long term? You want to be asking some of those questions. I think for some products, yes. I think for many products, no. I think China is the right place to be. To me, the China is still the factory of the world. It's the place to go to get most things built. But if you have issues with intellectual property or you question your ability to protect your intellectual property, then maybe stay closer to home and so forth. The pest analysis, political, economic, social, technological, how do all these things impact my decision making? Even beyond the tariff, right? The tariff should be a piece of this broader discussion when you're thinking long-term strategy. Short-term strategy, get the customers their product. Long-term strategy, you're looking at total cost of ownership, managing your cost of goods, so forth.
Thank you so much for that answer. Now, this leads me to one of my last questions for our conversation regarding the EU trade relationship with the United States, which is based on your expertise and your insights, what are some misconceptions that people in the public are currently having regarding these tariff policies being put in place by the new administration? Do you feel that there is a negative misconception of these tariff policies? Is there a positive misconception? I suppose my question is framing around based on your observations, what are some confusions that people are having, and what are some misconceptions that you would like to clear up for business owners in Utah?
On issues like this, macro issues like tariffs, I do tend to hit the pause button on my judgment. And the reason is because we just don't know, right? Meaning, who ultimately is going to bear the burden of these tariffs? This may cause some reimagination of certain products and systems, and we may have lower costs. We may find that the factories and the customers, they absorb a lot of those costs. And so we see very little in terms of the way it affects us individually and personally, or it may drastically hit our pocketbooks. What I would say is I think the markets give us a little bit of an insight into confidence levels. So you may remember if we go back to sort of January, February time, the markets just tanked. And I think most people will look at their 401ks and go, oh, what is going on? But now we fast forward, right? We fast forward 6, 7 months, 8 months, and what we see is the markets have actually rebounded above where they were and have actually grown in a quite healthy fashion. And so I think, again, the markets are quite robust. And that sort of reflects supply chains, that supply chains are also robust. And they have a way of being able to absorb some of these changes. So what I would say is, yes, there is no doubt in my mind that these tariffs, the speed that they've come, and the changes that are taking place have certainly caused tension in the market and tension in supply chains. But I think the key is that we don't overreact because in that coil, that spring of the market, it can absorb a lot. And I think clearly the market is sending a signal that the globe, from the Western perspective, from the US perspective, that we're going to be okay. Now, does that mean that prices for certain products won't go up? No, I believe they will. And those could be, I don't know, products at the grocery store, all the way through to medical products, to cars, and so forth. But prices probably will go up. But the market also realizes that we can only bear so much. And so there will be an auto correcting. So whenever we see prices that are too high, then companies will find interesting and innovative ways to serve the market differently. So I think that's what I would look for is let's not overreact. Let's allow the market to adjust. There may be some pain points, but ultimately I believe in allowing the market to do its job. People will not pay for things ultimately that they don't want. And so they'll reject the market and the market will have to reinvent itself. With that will come some pain, but I believe we will see a restabilization again. In other words, the future is bright.
Thank you for that. And I think that is something that a lot of people, from what I've observed in the news, has been reflecting on these tariff policies that no one is able to predict is going into place. With that being said, Professor, as much as I loved our conversation, we are coming up on time. Do you have any last thoughts or comments that you would like to make?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to say is just bring it full circle and say ultimately, global trade is two people coming together, trading products and services for money. And there's a common goal there, right? There's a common goal, there's a common interest. And I think we can't underestimate the power of the market to react, respond, and to reestablish a good pattern for the future. And so I think there will be some pain, but I think the upside is much better than the downside. And the future, like I said, is bright. Thanks for having me on, Kory.
Of course, Professor Greathead. And before we wrap up, I would like to give a quick shout out to World Trade Center Utah. They host Tariff Friday webinars that dive into the real world impacts of tariffs on Utah businesses. If you're looking to stay informed and hear from local experts like Professor Greathead, be sure to check them out.